Okay, my question to the panel to start is that do decision makers adequately understand that even without climate change, that we have considerable risks today? And has climate change helped to delay or stymie this conversation? Next question.
Okay, I'll bite. So, no, I don't think most of them actually fully understand the terminology that we're all very comfortable with. They don't understand about exposure. They don't understand about risk. They don't even understand how much good sense it makes to take mitigation actions, be it to elevate, harden, protect the envelope, whatever. There are a number of strategies that we know save you money in both the short and the long run, and I don't think they know that. And the climate thing, I think, was actually distracting for the last decade, because we talked about climate as though it was religion or a tooth fairy, and didn't think about how it exacerbated risk, whereas on the coast, at least on the east coast of the U.S., it severely exacerbates flooding and inundation risk.
I think I would agree with Margaret. Let me give an example. There are many people in New Orleans, including the mayor and some senators, who now think they are safe because they have a 100-year levee. That's not good. Another Katrina plus a little bit is going to overwhelm them, just like Katrina did. Yet they're sitting there thinking that now, because the Corps spent $14 billion, to build them a 100-year levee, they're safe. Interestingly, I think New Orleans, and Denise can attest to this better than I, but I think New Orleans has been thinking about climate change for some time. Adaptation or actually doing something about it are two different things. It's kind of like New York City. They've been thinking about it also, but that doesn't mean that they've done any adaptations yet.
I think I don't know if I would go as far as to say that people in New Orleans or South Louisiana have been thinking about climate change. I think they're very sensitive to climate and weather and events. I think the idea that they change over time, many people do appreciate that, but we are stuck in this cycle of either feeling safe or feeling vulnerable. It's like a binary thing. You've either got some protection or you haven't. And the idea that you're only protected against a certain level of event is really not getting across even in I don't think South Louisiana at all. Particularly in the more urbanized areas where the flooding has been less frequent. I will say that in the more rural areas of coastal Louisiana, which do not have any hurricane protection, where they flood more frequently. I don't know if you remember, I pointed out kind of just briefly where I live, like southwest of New Orleans, about 60 miles, no hurricane protection. I've lived there 25 years. That community has flooded from tropical storms and hurricanes, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 times during that period. I think those people are very sensitized to the fact that they're vulnerable. The challenge is as soon as they get a levee, they're going to feel safe. And this idea of it being a binary thing is really part of the challenge. And yet, hey, $14 billion is a lot of money. And so I think that it should buy something. The challenge is just conveying the idea of what it has bought and what would it cost to protect a city like New Orleans, or I don't want it to be all about New Orleans, some other cities from a bigger event. If Katrina was a 400-year event, what does it really take to protect against that? I don't think we're going to afford to do that. So, it's a communication struggle. We all know that, but I don't think there is a gradation. I think it's a binary thing.
Nick, in terms of what the group is commenting on is that there seems to be a dichotomy in U.S. policy right now where we've been in denial about climate change. It seems to have clouded the debate about risk. Have you seen a similar issue or a similar challenge in the UK or other parts of Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we share some of the scepticism, in society about climate change traditionally. It's quite a difficult one to communicate about, because we'll tend to sort of, if it rains heavily during the summer, we'll go, oh, it's climate change, is it climate change? And then the next summer it'll be drought, and well, that's climate change as well. But I thought you said it's going to be wetter winters and drier summers, but we've had lots of wet summers. So it's kind of getting across the fact that it's a trend rather than, well, it was quite cold today, so I don't believe in global warming. That's quite a difficult one. And that has kind of tended to disrupt the discussion slightly. I think we're making headway. I think within DEFRA there's quite a strong understanding of climate change and its impacts. It's just a question of what sort of predictions that we use. I think earlier we were talking about the scale of sea level rise. Well, 1.9 meters is our sort of outside high, real high risk scenario if we get rapid ice sheet loss. Well, actually we are getting rapid ice sheet loss, so maybe we start to think about that rather than as an outside contingency, as a bit more sort of reality. I've just also mentioned some of my examples were of small villages, and I think you were saying as well, there tend to be adaptation in small places. The Royal Institute of British Architects had a think tank who did a little project recently on how some of this stuff would look like in big cities in the UK. We've got some of the most unsustainable cities in Europe, very low lying. And they tried to vision how those cities would adapt. It was quite an interesting exercise, and it came up with some quite zany stuff. I think it said Hull could become the Venice of the North. Well, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Hull. There is architecturally no question that Hull will ever be the Venice of the North, but it's
Venice, Louisiana.
yeah. I mean, it just got people thinking, and that was the main point.
All right. Any questions from participants? Terry, and speak loudly.
That's never a problem for me. My question is, does the panel think that the minimum standards of the National Flood Insurance Program, core levies, and the other programs that are federally backed, federal initiatives, federally sponsored, has given our communities a false sense of security because they came from the federal government to begin with? And if you think that's the case, what do you think we can do to counteract that misbegotten notion?
I think that's an interesting question. I think that from my perspective, as I said earlier, the association that I make is that the programs make people feel safe or protected, or that they're going to be compensated in the case of the NFIP. I don't think it matters whether it's federal or not. That's my thought. I don't know if that works for other people. I think that what it does do, because it is federal, is make a sense of entitlement, which is perhaps different from making them feel vulnerable or not. I think that there's an expectation that those things are going to continue because they're federal, whereas if I think they were funded by more local sources of money, then there may be more of a connectivity to the kind of temporary or perhaps the changing nature of things. When you live down the bayou in Louisiana, the federal government is a long way away, and so the idea that there is dynamism and change in that government is more difficult to appreciate than what you see your local councilman engaging on.
I would agree with that, Denise. That's why I like to use the term federal taxpayer rather than federal government.
Mm-hmm.
Because when people say the federal government's going to pay for that, they don't know who that is. But when you say federal taxpayer, it puts a face on it. And I think that's what's paying for it. Yeah, there is this connecting local activity to the creation of future disasters that we don't do very well. We're probably going to do that better in the future because there isn't going to be that federal dollar there. We saw a lot of that debate in Sandy supplemental saying, you're just throwing money at this without knowing what you're doing. But again, as I say, you're going to have to change that policy between disasters, not in the middle of a disaster. We'll see. We'll see if we get there or not. doing things like Howard Kunruther talks about it and saying, community, you buy the flood insurance policy for the whole community. And then, when you allow all that development at risk out there, guess what? The community flood insurance policy cost is gonna go up. So the rest of the people in the community can see that the community action is having an impact on risk. Those are the kinds of things that connect cause and effect.
So can I just pick at Larry a bit for this?
Sure.
For this, allow all that development at risk. I really want you to kind of parse that out a bit for me, because it sounds like it's individual homeowners and individual decision-making. And a lot of it, certainly the idea that there are these big things that we as a country want and need to go on in coastal areas, does that play into all of this development at risk? If we want to get offshore wind farms going, there's going to have to be some facility at the coast in order to support that. Does that count as all this development at risk? There's this, for me, there's this dichotomy between these things that are, you know, really collectively in the societal interest versus the individual homeowner decision. And I think we kind of lump it all together a bit too much.
I agree, it's not the individual homeowner. For example, most people don't build their home, they buy a home. So they're not making the decision where to build. They're buying what's available.
Right.
So it's the community decision makers that are saying, the developer told me that we'll get this many jobs if we build out here, and I don't know how much he gets in his campaign coffers, that's beside the point. But the point is that it's usually not the typical individual homeowner making that decision. It's the community officials making that decision. And is some of that development good? Is it economic development? It is. But I have to go back and echo what Margaret said. Just because we need the coastal economy doesn't mean everybody has to live on the coast to service it. I expect we could service the oil industry in New Orleans with everybody in Baton Rouge, and for what we spent, $150 billion we spent in New Orleans, we could have built a railroad that runs there every 3 minutes.
We still would have raised the road to Port Fourchon, though, because so much of our fuel stocks come into Port Fourchon. So there are critical infrastructure that we're going to have to continue to cite and engineer and make more resilient. I also think in this country we're going to have much more regional economic and infrastructure planning than we have in the past. This is in part going to be borne by the fact that many smaller communities no longer can even afford to underwrite the bonds for infrastructure. So we're already seeing that take place in some places. Some are more enlightened. You guys up in the Minnesotas, you seem to be more enlightened on that. But I think that it's really important to understand that it's not the individual homeowner. In fact, I think we're just the deluded ones. But it is how we approach our footprint on the landscape that shapes everything. And individuals will go where the water and sewer is. That's, well, except unless, of course, they go to Alaska. But anyway, you know what I'm saying. Most people follow the infrastructure. So I think that as we think about WRDA and we think about the Farm Bill and we think about DOT Tiger grants, and EPA water and sewer grants, I think that's our real opportunity. The other real opportunity I think we have, I can remember way back when, before the Department of Homeland Security, when FEMA actually had money to buy out homes. In fact, I can even remember back in the 90s when Upton Jones amendments to the Coastal Zone Management Act had some monies to buy out properties, now largely on the Outer Banks, because that's where Wally Jones was from. But I think that we do need to think about making those kinds of investments. How do we get smarter about building our infrastructure? How do we buy out people? Particularly think about, there are portions of New Jersey, there are portions of southern Florida, as well as the Southwest, where people have actually walked away from their properties, the red fields, right? Usually the problem is people want to go right back in their property, so we have a little challenge, and we want to get that tax base back. But around Charlotte Harbor, Florida, there's whole subdivisions that people have walked away. Why aren't we negotiating a deal with Treasury and Bank of America and Nature Conservancy or whomever to let the bank, or HUD, because they own a lot of real estate now, to let them give the land to TNC, write off part of that cost, and let's bulldoze that stuff, because it shouldn't have been built in the first place, and convert it into a green field, a buffer.
All right,
Shall I just weigh in from the?
please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck in many ways at how nice you are in the US, and one way is underwriting people's flood insurance. We're much more horrible in the UK, and it's all private, and that is quite widely available. But the Association of British Insurers has basically come out and said, look, you can't count on people in high risk areas getting flood insurance per se now. It's just happening too often. I mentioned there's no insurance for coastal erosion. One thing, we're getting people aware by the fact, but through finance in many ways, of the problem. And the other way that we're doing that, apart from insurance, is about how we actually build defences and decide what to do. It used to be the system that you do a cost-benefit analysis of building the defence against what you're protecting, and you either got funding or you didn't. You had to be about 8 times up on the cost-benefit to get anything. And if you didn't get anything year on year. So it's quite competitive. Now we've changed that to make it partnership funding, where we invite people to contribute to the scheme. Is a very nice way of putting it. Basically saying, we've done the sums and we can't afford to do this in the long term, so you're going to have to pay as a community, or at least contribute, depending on how that cost benefit stacks up. So we're getting people involved by actually getting them to help design what they can do, and that can sometimes mean that they go, no, we can't afford to just build another wall. Maybe we have to think a bit more imaginatively, come up with a cheaper option, which can be an opportunity for working environmental benefits in there. And that actually is sort of, it's early days, but it's sparking some more imaginative thinking in that way. So,
All right. Other questions? Mike Buckley.
Margaret, this one is for you. Nick, you talked about shoreline management plans on your small island, and I thought that was very interesting that in developing those plans, you look many, many decades into the future, and nothing is off the table. All options are there, and it forces the communities, the residents there, to really think about long-term what's going to happen and how they're going to deal with these various changes. So, Margaret, you mentioned the Coastal Zone Management Act is up for reauthorization. What about including some type of long-term plan where you look at various options, whether to harden the shoreline, you retreat, you build dunes and rebuild beaches and so forth? How about putting some provision in the CZM Act?
I think that would be a great thing, but just let me say, I haven't actually found anyone on the Hill who wants to reauthorize the CZMA. So I'm going to pick on WRDA again, because I know WRDA is going to happen. And I think there are things that we can do inside the WRDA bill, for instance. Nick mentioned cost-benefit analysis. 30 years ago in a WRDA bill, there was a reason why we sharply discounted the future and the formula of how we do cost-benefit analysis. I do think 30 years on, we have less good reasons to sharply discount the future. If we even altered how we do cost-benefit analysis in this country, we could have some profound effects on what does roll forward and what doesn't roll forward. But I'm with you. But let me point out one thing, as a recovering lawyer who actually went to law school in Louisiana, which practices civil law like 95% of the world instead of common law like 5% of the world. Even though, just had to get it in, even though the U.S. does adopt the same common law system of our cousins from that wee island, here's the fundamental difference. In Britain, since something around the time of 1066, there's actually been an assumption of relationships with regard to the foreshore. Meaning, that's where that whole construct of public trust is, that we imported into this country. We imported the construct of public trust in this country, but we did not import the same historical and cultural resonance. So we don't actually really mean it in this country. We talk about it a lot, but we don't actually mean it. So if we actually did what our cousins do, then we actually could have some great shoreline management plans. I'll pick on South Carolina. So We did back in '88 one of the country's first truly significant shoreline setback plans. At the time, it was pretty monumental. We said if you live on the coast and Mother Nature kicks the crap out of you and you need to substantially rebuild, then you have to set back to the 30-year erosion rate. And that was really a BFD, except for the fact that our governor had a house on the beach. And what was it? Within a matter of months, we were abandoning that thing that we had just done that was so monumental.
Not abandoning, altering significantly.
Well, let's just say we challenged the scientific basis of that 30-year erosion rate, which was, well, let me say, certainly I learned a long time ago on Barrier Islands, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, and nowhere is that more true than on Barrier Islands.
Okay, next question. Steve.
I always hate it when people, you're on a panel, you're testifying, and they make a statement in the form of a question, but I'm going to kind of do that a little bit. One of the things is I don't concede that WRDA is going to happen this year. I think that, the last WRDA is supposed to be every 2 years. The last one was 2007. The one before that was 2000. There are no earmarks, something that we worked a lot on. But anyway, but I do think it is a key lever, and I think that it is looking at some of these legislative levers. And so, I mean, part of our interest of being here is you look at, for instance, in the last period of years, half of the Corps' budget, for instance, has come through disaster spending, not through the regular appropriations process. And when you look at the Sandy supplemental, you look at the fact that we waive cost sharing for the vast majority of the construction funding, which talk about getting the financing and the incentives all wrong. And so, from my perspective, I'm curious in your response to, it is about, and I guess one last thing I was just going to say about people follow development. I think it's a more vicious cycle. I think the people go there, the more development occurs. The more people go there, more development occurs. Essentially, it kind of continues and it exacerbates itself until we're in this very overbuilt infrastructure that is very hard to buy out and very hard to move out. And so what I thought was very interesting, I love the idea of going to the generally accepted accounting principles and the idea of having to write off the property value as subsidence occurs. But so I guess the key question that I'm going to go back to you on is, what are some of these financing levers that we could either do administratively, considering that legislation has not really been moving that well in Congress? Right. And what are some of the things that we all can advocate? Because if you look at my paper, that was really what I saw, is that this Sandy did represent an opportunity similar to, in a much more negative sense, the Ash Wednesday storm was an opportunity and changed the way that we looked at doing the coast and started the beach building. And so I just kind of opened that back up.
So let me just say about WRDA, you're right, it may not happen this spring, but unlike COBRA and CZMA, or even for that matter, the Clean Water Act, it will likely happen sooner rather than later. Coastal Zone Management Act has been up for reauthorization for 15 years, and I can't get anybody who wants to move it. That's a different issue. So I think you make some great points. Yes, I simplified the story. What begets what? But I do think I've watched this happen many a time before. You know, a regional authority decides they want to plop a water tower and a sewer line here, and the next thing you know, you got a lot of subdivisions, then we got to build more roads and blah, blah, blah. So there are many ways to skin a cat. I don't think they all require legislation, especially since we can't get any. Now, I would have thought that this administration, since he announced a climate agenda in the State of the Union speech, and I don't know about you, but at least in my agency, the next morning we were scrambling. We had 3 hours to turn around a climate agenda. Right. So maybe, maybe in theory they could issue an executive order and say that all federal expenditures on infrastructure have to be hazard and climate resilient. I don't think that's going to happen because that's a really ballsy kind of thing to happen. But I do think that in each of our agencies, for instance, NOAA has the privilege of sitting in the Department of Commerce, right? And one of our other sister agencies in the Department of Commerce is called the Economic Development Administration. Now, most of you guys probably haven't heard of them, and there aren't a big money agency like DOT or EPA or even the Corps They only have about 120 million or so that they spend on an annual basis, but it's often actually for rural water and sewer projects. Now, we've had a lot of turnover in the head shed, but I've been urging everybody in the Commerce head shed, okay, so the Secretary of Commerce could issue an administrative order that says any of this money from EDA or from NOAA could actually have these requirements associated. The same at DHS. Their Office of Science and Technology has spent, I don't even know how many hundreds of millions of dollars on resilient infrastructure research projects. So why don't we take that knowledge and have an administrative order come down from, has she left yet? Is she the only one not leaving? Have the Secretary of DHS issue an executive order that says, for her agency only, that says this shall be done. There are things that we can actually do that don't require legislation, and I think at this moment of impasse, we need to be looking at those very closely.
Okay, questions from this side of the room? Chad?
I kind of want to follow up on Mike Buckley's question, and that's on long-term planning. And be interested in the experience of the UK, especially in fostering folks thinking 50 years, 100 years out. And for the rest of the panel, what are those other things that could be done here in the States to maybe foster that kind of thinking, or is it an impossibility? When I was on my community planning board, our comprehensive plan horizon was 10 years. I mean, there's no way we could have gotten any longer than that in Ohio, and so it's not, we generally aren't long-term thinkers, but I think about one of the previous forums in which a demographer was talking about the average lifespan of a residential home is over 150 years. So clearly we need to do it. How do we get there? Thanks.
Shall I kick off with our experience and then?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it looks quite tidy on the slides, doesn't it? It's not that tidy in reality. I mean, we've the shoreline management plans, which I was just talking about, were completed in 2010, and they were actually the second round of shoreline management plans. We did a first stab at these in the sort of mid to late 90s. And that was at a time when the coastal groups weren't really fully formed, so local authorities were still thinking quite parochially. And basically, they used the opportunity to say, we want to carry on doing exactly what we're doing for 100 years, please. And you can fund it, please, central government. And DEFRA basically said, right, go away and do it again, and be more imaginative. So in that sense, they also got the public consultation a bit wrong, so it was more the decide, announce, defend type stuff. These second round, it's been a learning experience, and I suppose they've just been a bit more successful in that sense. It's clearly, like I said, they're not statutory. It's clearly not going to be something that we can do 100% reliably to think 100 years down the line. Britain, rate we're going at the moment, will be a developing country in 100 years anyway, so who knows what we're going to be able to afford to do. And also the evidence base that you're using to justify your decisions drops off reasonably rapidly. By about 50 years, you're really in very uncertain territory. But you can at least begin to think about things and sort of just scope out ideas and see what the trajectory is probably going to be. And I think that's been quite successful. There's been a lot of blowback from communities who haven't been happy about it. And there's been a certain amount of hedging in some areas where, rather than choosing one of those 4 policies, they've said, we'll monitor, manage, and review the situation. And they've generally been slapped down and said, no, you've got to choose one of these. You've got to just nail your, position to the wall a little bit more and be a bit more brave. But there's a lot that sits underneath those policies. So but it's been a positive experience, I think, just to actually do the exercise. And there are material considerations in the planning process. So they're not statutory, but they do carry weight.
Can I just add that I think that one of the challenges that we have is the common evidence base, and we tend to argue about, what's the right sea level rise rate and what really is the climate projection going to be, instead of really just looking at what the possibilities might be in some kind of scenario planning exercise. I think we've been stuck in water resources planning anyway, in this very deterministic planning process where we pretend that we can calculate cost-benefit ratios at decimal place kind of magnitudes. We've convinced ourselves that we can do that, and when you convince yourself that you can do that, then you can get just paralyzed by the uncertainty of thinking far out into the future. And so I do think that that we're starting to get beyond that. Certainly, the National Climate Assessment, I think, is going to go a long way towards pointing towards these different options for the future and what the condition might be. And hopefully, now the National Climate Assessment is going to be a recurring thing, and that is still the expectation,
Yes,
right, Margaret?
yes.
That will then provide the evidence base. I don't think you should expect this NCA now to be a strong evidence base, but I think that would be a really good role for something like that, for an interagency collective, everybody working off the same sheet of paper as far as the information is concerned, right? That's one thing I heard from you. And it doesn't mean to say that we have one prediction of what the future is, but we all agree on which ones we're going to use to think about. So I think we could get there, and I see a shift in thinking, but it's a big ship to steer, so it's going to take a while.
Just the draft National Climate Assessment is the U.S. version of the IPCC, so IPCC Light. The draft, the whole ensemble of the draft documents are now available for public review and comment until early April. So Google it and comment. You'll especially want to look at the extremes chapter, the sea level rise scenario chapter, and whatever region you're in. You should look at your regional chapter. And I, of course, would recommend that you also look at the estimable coast chapter.
Do you look at the coast chapter?
Okay, in terms of the design of this event and in terms of what we've done in the past, we've always looked at co-equal objectives in terms of our focus, both on the human risk side as well as the resource or ecological side. So my question to the panel is, as we move forward, which presents bigger challenges, which presents long-term economic risks to our society? Is it the human side of the equation, or is it the natural resource side of the equation?
Well, one of the things I've seen since the New York State 2100 Commission, particularly the report on recovery, it's kind of ironic to me that the city of New York really wants to do a lot around green infrastructure, even though the real opportunities are fairly limited. Whereas, in contrast, New Jersey, there are a lot of opportunities to do some innovative things in terms of green infrastructure and defining whatever we mean by living shorelines and all those kinds of things. And yet there's less political will to do it there. So it's kind of ironic because New Jersey's really ripe and New York's pretty much all the way hardened up, and there's only a couple of places, Long Island Sound, behind Staten Island, a couple of places. But I think the whole idea of using nature's defenses will actually get a big push off of Sandy. That's my observation, and I think it's the right thing. Carolyn, Resources for the Future is actually working with a team of people to actually try and monetize the value of ecosystem services. I think that will be very helpful. That relates to also my comments about cost-benefit analysis. If we could roll them into the equation right now, the green side is wholly out of the equation for the most part.
But if I can say something about that, and we have to be careful what our expectations are of green infrastructure. It can do a great job on water quality. It can do a great job on providing, fisheries habitat support, recreation, things that can be monetized that are very valuable. I think there are only a few cases where green infrastructure can do substantial, can help substantially with flooding. You have to have a lot of it, and not just a little rim around the edge. It might help you with a bit of wave protection on your levees, but when you're talking about flood and inundation, you've got to have a lot of it to make a difference. And so I think that there are lots of reasons to do green things, and we should do them. We should make sure we remember those reasons as well, and not get too caught up on the fact that we're going to restore a bit of marsh and it's going to save us from flooding, because I think there we have to be really clear about what that contribution is. And there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there that needs a bit of a reality check a lot.
But oyster reefs can be a good burn. Now, I think South
But
Louisiana
not for
is,
storm surges, maybe for waves.
For wave
but we've got a load of
attenuation.
oyster reefs.
it can
that we
be good
still
for
have.
wave attenuation, that's my
Yeah,
point.
waves and inundations.
That's why the Dutch call it multiple lines of defense. So they
Yeah.
have engineered stuff, and they have natural
Yeah.
stuff, and they elevate, and they harden, and they do all kinds of things, and they're moving people out of the low country.
So
Well,
wait-
I don't know. Even the Netherlands is using it for storm surge storage. So, there are instances. I'll go back to your statement, and I agree with it, Denise. It says there's no two places alike. Everyone has different options, and we don't want to do away with the options. Look at Napa. They took 3 feet off their flood levels through the city of Napa by opening up a wetland. So there are places it works. There are places where levee setbacks make a huge difference in flood levels and the intensity and the erosion, the problems that are created. But there's no one solution to it. There has to be individual approaches that look at all the options.
I think that I was making my comments in relation to coastal systems and storm inundation. I think I absolutely appreciate the NAP, for example. I absolutely appreciate the floodplain riverine effect. But I think if we're telling people who live in coastal environments that they're going to be protected from a Sandy
No.
or a Katrina through
No.
wetlands, then that is not the right message to give them. So that was really the example. I'm not
Exactly.
I'm not
I
arguing
understand.
against
No,
that.
Neither wetlands nor levees will help you.
I just second that. I mean, the fact that I think there are two things, aren't there? There's the spatial targeting of where you put the things. That's a very important aspect of it, and also the trade-off. So, for example, if you're thinking about ecosystem services, biodiversity, there's wave attenuation, there's tidal storage, there's water quality, there's carbon sequestration, and it's partly scale, and it's also what are you managing it for? Is it primarily tidal storage? Well, you're probably going to have to sacrifice some biodiversity for that. Or is it, what have you? And that works for inland as well. We have a catchment, very much a river catchment-based approach to planning for water in England, which is really very much on the ground as well, not just planning. And that goes doubly for inland. When you're managing a catchment, where do you put certain measures throughout the catchment to attenuate flood transport and water quality, what have you. But I think at the end of the day, if you do manage to get all these things into the way that you do your cost-benefit analysis, it captures what Denise was saying, which you can manage the expectations because you can make a stab at least of monetizing what can't be monetized, but essentially just trying to capture it in a bit more of a kind of definite way, which says exactly what sort of benefit you are going to get, and you can manage expectations.
In terms of risk of moving from being facilitator to the panel, I think the cautionary note I would throw on this discussion in terms of monetizing the natural resource base goes back to a paper that Jackie Mundy and I wrote for the last one. And in that paper, what we identified is that most modern economics does not properly understand nor value the natural resource behind it. And monetizing it tends to even diminish that. And so the issue is that we have set forth on policy that assumes that we have a finite natural resource base, whether it's water, whether it's fisheries, whether it's forests, whether what have you. And so we have totally discounted the value of that resource. But if you go back to classic economics and you take a look at what was there, that essential resource base was real. That's why this country was able to get off to such a fast start, because of our abundant resources. And so I would suggest for the group, and as part of the discussion here, is we can't give short shrift to this notion of monetizing, because I think in modern economics, we are only getting this deep into the true underpinning there, which is what is the extent of our fisheries, what is the extent of our biomass production, what is the extent of our waters, which is the underpinning of our economy. So that's just, I think, something to take away as you get into discussions. Okay. Joanne.
Thanks, Joanne Mills. Both Larry and Margaret mentioned the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and I'd like both of you to say how you envision COBRA morphing into the future to help us build more resilient, sustainable coasts.
How we can use COBRA for that, implement it the way it was written. That'd be a good start. Because we really haven't had a lot of success in some cases it's worked well, in other cases it's not working very well. You'd have to go back and read the audit. It's been a couple of years since I read it. I think it was GAO that did it, wasn't it? So there's some issues with it that needs to be ironed out. But it's kind of like, if you look at the federal executive order on floodplain management, it's probably one of the best written executive orders. And if we were to follow it for everything the federal government spent its money on, we wouldn't be doing half the things we're doing. So there's a long distance between the lip and the cup. And it's difficult. These aren't easy things to administer, but it's difficult also if you don't have an oversight group saying, is it being implemented appropriately? Who's overseeing COBRA? I mean, is there any enforcement action? Is there any ability to change things? So it's kind of the same thing with the executive order. It's all individual or agency implementation to say, yeah, we're following the executive order. And whether they are or not, there's not really a cop to figure it out.
I think, Ed, did you have a specific comment on that question?
I do. There is an article that David Conrad is co-authoring for the Brookings Institute that I think is directly on point. Talks about how we can expand COBRA and make it work. Following up on what Margaret said about her profound gratitude for all y'all contributing to her quality of life, I would like to join in that, may I say, as a resident of the special flood hazard area in Boston, on Boston Harbor. Taking a look at the economic forces that we've been spending a lot of time talking about, David's co-author article is talking about saying, okay, fine, having the federal government in some areas, not necessarily just the coastal barrier resources areas, but other selected areas as well, essentially saying we walk away. The primary things that we didn't walk away from in the coastal barrier resources area was IRS casualty losses, IRS deductions from mortgage, local taxes. Huge support for development even in the COBRA areas, continued on. So we start with that. We then go on, following on, going beyond the article that David has written, which also advocates some innovative thoughts of like the executive orders have the force of law. Why don't we enforce them? What a thought. Enforce Executive Order 11988 and 11990, both. Take this to another step that's pioneered by the American Bar Association, which advocates catastrophic insurance for everybody as part of your homeowner's packet, made affordable with zoning and planning, building codes that drive down the risks and consequences so that a community can say, look, we're going to let anybody do what they want to do. Laissez les bon temps rouler. Let the good times roll, fine. Just like what we do today. And that's your rate. That's what you choose. This is the rate in your community. We've done this with fire insurance. Pete Thomas from Willis Reinsurance did the finest presentation I have ever heard in my life on insurance at Disasters in the Environment Conference. Take that concept that worked, has worked to reduce the risks and consequences of river and fires, and take it for all hazards. So I think to answer your point, we can expand on the lessons of COBRA and make them much more universal and save a small fortune. The Conrad co-authored paper for Brookings with me. That paper, I think, will help us frame this in terms of budgetary savings, actual money, and then expanding that to include the concept advocated by the American Bar Association, which is a very conservative organization. House of Governors has advocated this concept of universal insurance made affordable. I think we're on the way to thinking about at least the economic part of this, and then we have to weave in the environmental part as well. So that's my thought.
All right, we've got time for one more question. If you can get your hands up here. John Cussler.
Maps. More better maps, more better accurate current condition maps. So in
What do we do when we have a Sandy and all the dunes and beaches go, and suddenly your topography disappears? We keep mapping every 10 years.
Well, there is a risk map program that FEMA has, although in their defense, it does not necessarily get you the updated delineation of the floodplain. It does get you better digitized data that is available. One of the good things that has happened, and I'm hoping it will continue to happen, is Army Corps, USGS, NOAA, to a degree FEMA. We've all been trying to do a better job of synchronizing our LiDAR collection, so we're at least not collecting lots of places a bunch and some places none. If we could get NRCS, in Ag, Natural Resources Conservation Service, which actually has more money for mapping than all of us rolled together to play with this. And we might even actually get a national flood and coastal mapping program. But right now, you don't have a coastal mapping program at all. And you do have FEMA's risk map. But remember that FEMA has to engage in a political process in order to change the delineation of floodplains. That's one of the reasons Fire Island never was designated as a floodplain.
Can I add something on that? I mean, I absolutely support the idea that we need better maps, and I would, one of the things, as a coastal scientist, dealing with the dynamics of a surge moving in on the coast, it's not just the topography that we need, it's the bathymetry.
Thank you.
Which is really in many places much weaker than the topography. We work on some 1930s surveys still for the state of the art storm surge modeling in coastal Louisiana. So that's a big need, but these coastal storms are fickle. And we had an interesting experience, probably been overshadowed now by the storm beginning with S, the storm beginning with I, with Isaac in coastal Louisiana, where the storm just stopped at the end of August. And relatively small storm, not a huge kind of whole coast of Mexico storm, not a very strong wind speed, but it just stopped. And none of our probabilistic ways in which we use the JPMOS scheme that we use to calculate what the 1% event is, all of those storms that we use in those analyses, they just keep going. Some might move at 8 miles an hour, some might move at 12, but they just move in our models. They don't stop. And so the idea of having maps is great, but the idea that you can really say what any particular storm is going to do is something that, again, we have to work out how, in those very two-dimensional things, we get error bars on those maps, if you like, and that's a really difficult thing to do.
Well, that gets into another scientific challenge. So the Safer-Simpson index is actually just winds aloft. Okay, so it's just the force of the atmospheric field. I forget how many feet above ground that is, but a distance above ground. And it doesn't have anything to say about the precipitation associated with that event, which we have seen has become much more intense. In fact, on the coast, we used to mainly worry about the water coming in from the sea, and now these storms have been so pregnant that lately we're not just Katrina, we're getting it on the backside too, because they're just so full of rain that the watershed then comes and floods us on the second run around. So this is part of our challenge. We don't actually have a methodology for understanding these events and their impacts, because that's related to the built and the natural environment. And finally, one more thing. So the shallow bathy on the nautical charts, Denise, NOAA has never collected, except in recent emergency supplementals, NOAA has never collected data outside of the navigation channel. So any shallow data that you have on any of your nautical charts, any of you, day boaters. Know that 30 or 50 years ago, it was extrapolated data. And I'm a lawyer, but I do know that extrapolation of extrapolated data that's 50 years old is crap.
Okay. Before we go to housekeeping right now, what I would like to do is just offer for the panel members a free bite at the apple. Anything that you've heard, anything you want to expand upon in terms of your comments already.
Well, I do want to say, I always have something to say, that's why you asked me to sit here, right? Is that the issue that Margaret just touched on at the end there, I think, you know, at the coast, one of the things that I've been trying to convey is how these coastal flooding issues are a bit different from some of the riverine flooding issues. Not necessarily, you know, worse, but just different in terms of understanding them. But the real challenge, certainly with hurricanes, is when the precipitation flooding interacts with the coastal flooding. It's enormously difficult for us to deal with from a technical standpoint, for us to really get our arms around and do any kind of real predictions on. And so how those two come together, and remember, that's why we're at the coast to begin with for a lot of these really important commercial purposes, is because it's where the river meets the sea, that's where the big ports are, that's where the big cities are. And so we've always got that juxtaposition. So it's not really about how we deal with coastal storms or anything like that, or how we deal with a particular storm. It's really how we deal with flooding in this very kind of difficult to predict environment, and how we convey any kind of sense of expectation, either on the safety side or on the vulnerability side to people, is very difficult.
Well, that's why, and I agree with that, Dan. It's excellent, because what it gets to a big part of our concern now is we're trying to predict the flood, and then we do this in or out line.
Yeah.
And until we start to map gradation of risk, knowing that way up to the 500 and beyond, you still have risk, we're going to have this problem. So, because we can't predict that.
No.
It's all there is to it. So we've got to help people understand the gradation and the range of risk rather than absolute.
Shall I just sort of echo that in a sense? I think one of the things that I mentioned the 2007 floods we had in England, which were from pluvial pluvial water, surface water flooding, sewer flooding. We have combined sewers and combined storm overflows, we call them, which kind of take rainwater and sewage, so you can imagine what the consequences of that are. And fluvial flooding and tidal flooding all interacted, and essentially our response to the government in how we, what a good job we did in managing that, was that well, you see, the problem was that the local authority manages that sewer, whereas we do the tidal flooding, we do the and then these people that are really responsible for that river. People don't care about that. They just want to know that floodwater is floodwater to them. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's all sort of a bit smelly and nasty, and you don't want it in your home. And so the big challenge for us was the keeping it simple bit on the communications, which was just sort of saying, well, there's a whole load of data which we're sort of, which we've got. There's a lot of complex data, but how do we actually just get the messages across to the public in terms of the flood warnings, getting that out there? We've become experts. There are people out there in my organisation who use social networking to get messages out, this thing called Face something or other. And emails, texts, all the resources available to us in the language that they understand. But as you say, Larry, it's communicating the range of risk that's possible. And an example of that is we've got flood maps, we've got public-facing flood maps, public-facing coastal erosion maps, which show predictions 20, 50, 100 years of what people can expect. And for each of those 20, 50, 100 years, we show the range of what they might expect. And there's a little bit of text underneath it which just says why we're doing that. Because it's that whole uncertainty thing is one of the biggest challenges about simple communication to the public.
And we found that not only keeping it simple, but keeping it at the community level and using local landmarks as points of reference for changing water levels is a very telegraphic approach. On the West Coast, it's started out in San Francisco Bay, it now proliferates almost the whole coast. Volunteers, citizens, the king tide photographic You get these things in, and now it's actually gotten to South Florida. I mean, once a week I get a photo of Highway A1A underwater. So one of my goals, I've actually been talking to Climate Central, is how do we actually proliferate the king tide photo, high tide, floods against local landmarks all the way up the East Coast, because risk, we have to both deal with it formally and institutionally, but we also have to make it personal. Because at the end of the day, we all, there used to be this antiquated concept in the law called assumption of the risk. If you were dumb, knowingly dumb, and you did something, then that was called assumption of the risk. We kind of lost it. I think we need to find that again in our precepts, because we can't afford to keep bailing people out.
All right, with that, I would like to round of applause for our panelists.